So what I'd like to do is just get a perspective of real life. And I do have to say to Nick, where is he? It was a very powerful piece. And I think what made it even more so was the footage. I thought the footage was very, very important. Because so many of us have simply forgotten what man after man after man said to us over so long. And then to have this very sophisticated, sort of sharply, not confusing but difficult timeline and consciousness was extraordinary. So I really do congratulate you. Oh, by the way, the Evening Standard sacked me a long time ago, so give them no credit. Give them no credit at all. I don't work for them anymore. So can I start with you, Deborah?
Yes.
What were your impressions of the play first, just purely the work of art?
Oh, I'm just saying to Lisa, I feel I need some time to process it. I find it terribly effective. And my day job is I work for an NGO called Inquest, which works around deaths in custody and detention. And some of my work has been around deaths of people held in immigration detention and the death of Jimmy Mabenga, who was killed whilst being deported. And so for me, the image of somebody in desperation hanging themselves, self-harming, had a very, I have to say, a very deep-rooted kind of resonance. And also, I think the other thing that stood out for me was the whole issue around mental health and the absolute desperation of people who have fled countries for their own safety, seeking refuge, only to then find themselves in situations where their mental health is exacerbated by the experiences that they have in a country to which they thought they were going to get safety and sanctuary. So I feel quite, I have to say, I'm slightly surprised by how effective I feel by it. Partly because of what you just said, Yasmin, around some of the reviews that I glanced at before I came, talked about the comedy of it, and actually for me I felt more I felt kind of sad with it, and also the power relationship between the two for me, and the abusive nature of, and it raised issues for me, the relationship between them, and the kind of the power relation in a way also for me reminds us about how powerless and disenfranchised and alone people are who come to this country and find themselves in the kind of situations where they've got nobody, and often the only people who actually help them are other refugees and asylum seekers, or indeed the kind of charities working in the area.
And what I was very struck by, and you will know this of course from the stories you hear all the time, this very thin membrane between truth and lies, actually, for an exile or somebody who's fleeing for whatever reason. In my personal view, anybody who's fleeing for economic reasons is no different, really, from somebody who's fleeing for what we think we understand by persecution. And what people never realise, really never realise, 40 years on, I've been in this country for 40 years, and they still don't understand, even the nicest people, even my husband, who's English, will not understand that yes, you have the big house and the car and the safety and the security, and he said, you know, a safe country, a free country, a clean country, all of that, tiles in the bathroom even. You never ever can get the old country out of your head, your dreams, your nightmares. I still find myself saying back home about Uganda, where I come from. And I was privileged in that nobody was killing Asians. Actually, you know, we were lucky. And we were taken by Canada and Britain. Britain took the British passport holders, which was our right, not their generosity, but nevertheless. But that exile, the feeling of exile, umbilical cord that is cut when you did not plan it is something I find most people do not understand. Would I be right?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of themes coming through the play around the truth and lies. Very early on, the scene with the Home Office official when the word credibility was used, and we find that a lot with people's asylum claims being refused on the basis that there being inconsistencies in the account of their story the first time they talk to an official and then the second time. And you can see from this experience actually how you construct what's happened is going to change, particularly if it's traumatic. And there's a quite simplistic idea of how people might tell that story, and if there's a slight inconsistency, then it can be used to undermine the entire asylum claim. That, well, if you've made this mistake here, or if this is a lie, therefore all of what you're saying needs to be brought into question, and therefore that puts your claim at risk. And the mental health issues that came through, we work with people on a daily basis who are trying to get over their experiences at home, and the suddenness they have to leave. That was a really powerful,
yes.
The bag, go. Lots. What we hear a lot from politicians is we can't make this system easier, we can't be more generous when asylum seekers come here because it will encourage people to come. People will do asylum shopping. They will choose us over France, over Germany, over Spain. And actually the reality is it's push. People are pushed. They're pushed desperately, very suddenly. They pay agents to get out, and they arrive here often not knowing they're here, thinking they're going to be in France, thinking they're going to be in Germany. So there are really quite a lot of themes there that we see as part of our everyday work, and it's really powerfully performed.
I remember many years ago when The Spectator wasn't what it is now, which is a kind of magazine of the British Tea Party, really. There was a fantastic article, quite a long article, I'm talking about 10 years ago, I think, even more, by Alibhai, am I saying it right? Who had done a whole thing on the questions that refugees and asylum seekers are asked and why they're turned down. And I've never forgot one thing she said. Somebody had said there were crocodiles. They'd asked them all kinds of questions, and somebody from an African country, about the dangers. Then he had mentioned crocodiles in the river. And she had said to him, how big are the crocodiles? And he said something. And she said, aha, you're lying. Because I've checked, and the crocodiles are not that size, but this size. So you're lying. And I've never forgotten that, because it just seemed to me to exemplify the actually Kafkaesque, often, interrogation that people go through. And, we all know now, and we've known for a long time, how tricksy memory can be, even if you're not mentally ill. We know this, don't we? Dinner party, 1 month later, ask 6 people, they'll all remember different things. So, the concept of truth and lies in memory is a very interesting one. But going back to the play, Deborah, there was this very, I thought, interesting scene at the airport between whoever he was, the security from the private security company. What was that about to you? Why was he behaving that way?
The security guard?
Yeah.
Well, there's a big issue around the whole way that the state have outsourced their functions to the private sector. And for me, this came up very graphically during the inquest into Jimmy Mabenga's death, where, and for those of you that aren't familiar, Jimmy Mabenga was an Angolan man who'd lived in this country for many years, married, 5 children, all born in the UK. He had got into a pub fight, served a period of imprisonment following which he fell foul of the immigration rules and was being deported on a British Airways flight. As I said, the functions of the state are outsourced, and this was outsourced to G4S, who took him onto the British Airways flight, whereupon he was forcibly restrained by the 3 guards and died as a result of the fact that he couldn't breathe because of the way in which he was restrained. And in kind of just telling this, I can't go into obviously all the details, but the kind of significant issues were that for the G4S guards, they were working on 0-hour contracts. They only got paid on completion of a successful deportation. If the flight didn't take off because detainees or deportees were playing up and screaming and shouting, and the pilot decided not to take off, it meant that G4S and indeed the Home Office were fined, you know. And so essentially we're talking about private contracts, we're talking about money, we're talking about individuals for whom they needed the job done, as it was described, and what a whole culture had developed within the private security industry, G4S, which was exposed at the inquest, which was one of extreme violence and racism, including something that they called carpet karaoke, which meant the detainee would be pushed forward so that they were what they called singing to the carpet. In other words, their screams and shouts about the fact that they didn't want to be deported and any kind of resistance was muffled to then try and ensure that the pilot didn't terminate the deportation. What I think was so shocking about the inquest was it exposed the way in which the Home Office had completely lacked supervision and oversight of the private contracts. The fact that this was well documented in reports by NGOs about the fact that there'd been a pattern of previous deportations where deportees had complained about the excessive use of force, ill treatment. Also, the fact that this was a man who was screaming and shouting on the plane that he couldn't breathe, that he was dying, and nobody, none of the passengers, none of the British Airways crew came to his aid, even though they were trained in resuscitation. They had a defibrillator on board that was never used, and so he died. And I think the point I'll just end of is it's a very long and tragic and utterly inhumane story. But one of the things that Adrienne, Jimmy's widow, found so difficult was, and it's the thing that she found the most painful aspect of the evidence at the inquest, was that she said, how could nobody do anything? How could everybody turn away while a man is dying and is telling people that he couldn't breathe? And I think that really then moves us to the whole issue around the attitudes that some people hold towards refugees, asylum seekers, that they didn't see Jimmy Mabenga as a human being. They saw him as this kind of violent, illegal immigrant, being deported. The only other thing I just add just to the story is that after his death, the other thing that was exposed was that on the mobile phones of the G4S guards, there was found a whole load of extremely vile, racist texts and appalling anti-immigrant propaganda, absolutely horrendous. And I think it exposed that kind of culture of violence and racism that really was endemic, and I believe is still there today. The one thing that is happening is that the 3 individuals, the 3 guards concerned, because the inquest found a verdict of unlawful killing, and importantly, the family had access to legal aid so that they were represented during the course of that inquest, because you will not be surprised to know that there were teams of lawyers representing G4S, the Home Office, British Airways, the Ministry of Justice. I mean, there were teams of lawyers, and we had a legal team for the family. The 3 individuals have now been charged by the Crown Prosecution Service with manslaughter and will appear in court in November, and we'll see, and it's important that process is one that they have, clearly they have right through that process. The only thing I would say is that I was extremely disappointed and extremely frustrated by the fact that the Home Office, who outsource these functions but cannot absolve themselves of overall responsibility for what companies are doing and the oversight and management of that, they weren't prosecuted for corporate manslaughter, despite the fact that the risks of this kind of restraint and the knowledge base within the Home Office was definitely there, because there was documentation about previous.
Well, the journalists, much maligned though we are, we've been writing about this for years. Yeah. Absolutely the only people who are writing about this or bringing this up. But I was very struck by the relationship between the woman and the refugee. And it was a complicated relationship. Of course, it was a power relationship, but then it wasn't. And I certainly know myself that while officialdom and public attitudes have really hardened, there are extraordinary individuals who are still reaching out. Am I right?
Yeah, definitely. Earlier on this year, we were working on a campaign to try to persuade the government to resettle Syrians in the UK.
55 we've taken. We've
Yes.
taken 55.
Yeah, we're not letting it drop, you'll be pleased to know. But the government was saying, we'll push aid to the region, and we said, well, actually, you can also bring some people to the UK. We can accommodate and support. And at the point that the announcement was made that a new scheme was being set up, we had so many phone calls and emails,
really?
and it was actually really, really heartwarming. People saying, I have a spare room, I can take, just made us feel happy. We, as you would imagine, a lot of our work is being quite critical and being quite unhappy about things happening, and we just got really great responses from individuals saying, I can't donate any money, but I might be able to do this and do that.
That's fantastic,
and
because
it made us feel
on
really
the
good.
whole, the media has
absolutely.
been very responsible for some of the public attitudes. But when we came, although there was a lot of hostility, and Enoch Powell was really popular and so on, the people were exactly like this. They were opening their houses, they were bringing clothes, they were bringing nappies, they were bringing, bank managers would come to these settlement camps, and so I'm really pleased to hear that.
And I think, there is something quite specific about Syria. There have been a lot of news about it. People know what's going on, and they can associate the bad things with people coming, and that's often the case. People who are really hardened and don't particularly offer welcoming attitudes, sometimes when faced with an individual who tells the story. Some of the most terrible politicians we have seen on anti-removal campaigns with constituents, because they've spoken to that constituent and they believe their story, but it can sometimes be the exception rather than the rule. It gets mixed up with, particularly now around economic migration.
Yes.
And the rhetoric around, who's coming here and why. Actually, politicians have shifted slightly about how they talk about refugees, but the general public, the awareness is actually, it doesn't get differentiated, and there is a general anti-migrant attitude. People vastly overestimate how many refugees come into the country. The polling that we've done, it's like, over 100,000 a year, and they'll get £100 a week when it's 25,000 a year, and £35 a week, and of that 25,000, over 60% will have their application refused in the first instance. So, we do our best to get that information out and the accuracy out and the stories. Once you hear what people have experienced, then that's when you get the change. And the Syria work was really, and thanks to the Independent, were amazing during that campaign. And I'm not going to malign journalists.
You would buy papers.
The Independent did so much work on that, and gave us a lot of column inches in order to start pushing that message out. So, you know, I'm not going to be negative about all media, but there obviously are some that peddle myths, let's say.
The final really interesting question here was this pressure to become somebody else, because to be who you were when you left, it's almost like a stain once you come to a country and nobody loves you because you are this thing called an asylum seeker. So I thought that was dramatically very effective. This idea that if I change my name and I pretend I'm Mexican, then maybe I will be loved. You know, there's this extraordinary kind of need in people who leave their homes, which I found really touching and really beautifully done. But also behind that is who are you once you've left your country and once you've left people behind? What do you become? You have to invent yourself, you have to reinvent yourself. And the loss is terrifying. I was saying the other day to my husband, as I'm getting older, and I think, oh God, when I die, which might be soon, who knows, nothing of me will be left, because this country is so down on so much that I brought with me, so I shaved it off. Then my children shaved it off even more and even refused to speak any of the home languages. I speak 4 languages. My children almost deliberately rejected the languages because they didn't want to be different. And so there is a kind of terrible pathos that there is, besides a few photographs, you leave nothing of that life behind, because the only way you can be acceptable, and even then it's very, very difficult. If you read what they say about me out in the ether, it's extraordinary. I'm still not one of them. And the cultural loss, the cultural, linguistic, emotional loss is absolutely deep, I think. Which, again, I wish more people would understand. In Canada, where refugees go in Canada, the first thing they do is ensure their home languages don't die. They teach them English, and Denmark used to be like that before it went right-wing, that they keep their home languages up by getting teachers to teach the children. It doesn't happen here, and I think there's a terrible loss, but also a tremendous gain. We're safe, we're free, whatever. Questions, can we take a few questions? And if you want, you can say who you are, but if you don't, that's fine. Anybody got any comments or questions? Or anything?
Yes, I'd like to say something. I've listened, thank you all very much for all your comments and your discussions. One thing that struck me very much in the play, which hasn't been touched upon, is the fact that he was a Sunni and she was a Shia.
Yes.
And that his life was completely wrecked because of that. And in order to keep them safe, he then undertook his odyssey, which led him inevitably to his own destruction. And I found that was probably, there were many, many themes in the play that touched me. And like you mentioned, I never expected to be moved. I'm not English. I've lived here for many years. And I love living here, and I think it's a brilliant country. But the fact that this was an extreme case of somebody being removed forcibly from their country under incredible circumstances, and in the background you have the Blairs, the Bushes, the Obamas, the Camerons spouting out, and lives are being ruined. And I think this piece conveyed that to me more powerfully than anything else so far. It's really the civilizing power of theatre. I can't tell you, and thank you. I found it extraordinary and very, very powerful. But, the scene where she goes to him and says, you've got to go so that we can live. Oh.
But this is what happens in Northern Ireland even today.
Yes.
where a Catholic and a Protestant couple cannot live in certain areas. Their children are still beaten up in the streets, and we've had the settlement, thank God, but so on. And I'm a Shia Muslim. And certainly now, what is happening with ISIS, it is a complete hell, hell has arrived with these guys, because it's not just killing Shias, but it's killing Christians, it's killing every minority, and it's because of all of this religious. It never was like that when I was growing up. We never had this problem. We just never had this problem, and now we're all splitting off the way we are. It's very frightening. Any other question? Any questions to the maker of this piece?
Speak up a bit so I think everyone else can hear you. We have the writer over there. So.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Sorry, you're in the dark
Keep a look
a bit.
profile.
I was very interested in the structure where you deliberately deconstructed the chronological sequence of that. And I'm just interested in why you decided to do it that way rather than a more linear narrative.
I could give you a really complex answer to make you sound really intelligent, but I kind of always saw it that way. But I think one of the main reasons was also to look at the idea of how identity is constructed and taking that apart and putting it in a non-chronological way, seeing this man in different parts of his life and really making the audience think about who this person is, playing with that line of is he Carlos or is he Salim, and the reality, the act, the putting on the act aspect of it.
We ran the play in rehearsals. We worked on it chronologically, and it wasn't anywhere near as powerful. And it was quite a relief when we ran it in the order in which it was written. It would also have ended on a huge downer, because you would have ended in Heathrow. And at least the way it ends at the moment, although it's unfulfilled hope, it at least ends that someone is caring for someone else. And obviously it has gone wrong after that, but at least there's a human virtue in that.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question for the panel. I don't know how much you found the changes to legal aid have been affecting the kind of work that you're doing. You brought up the fact that the family qualified for legal aid. If you're going through this kind of a case and you don't qualify, how has that been impacting the kind of work that you're doing?
Well, there's an important issue that Lisa could probably pick up on better than me around the residence test, which had that been enforced, Jimmy Mabenga's widow would not actually have then qualified for funding for the inquest, because she wasn't at that time she wasn't a resident. So, but I mean, the whole issue of legal aid in my area of work, which is, as I said, around deaths in custody, is becoming increasingly difficult at a time when we're seeing an increasingly privatised prison, immigration detention and deportation system, where of course private companies have unlimited funds available to represent their interests and to defend their reputations and to defend their conduct. Likewise, the state always arms itself with lawyers at every inquest that I've ever attended, and so it's the only real opportunity for the family. And also, I think it's important to say for the public interest, that where somebody dies at the hands of the state or at the hands of a private company, the inquest is something that the state actually has given the family and the public to ensure that there is proper accountability and to ensure that there's proper scrutiny of what actually happened. So the closing down and the increasingly difficulties and the very intrusive, protracted system for trying to get public funding and legal aid is causing real problems, and it's something that we're working hard to try and kind of raise at kind of a government level. I think maybe Lisa can say more about the situation for people who are seeking asylum.
Well, thankfully, those in the asylum process are still in scope for legal aid for their asylum claim. What's difficult about that is that it's not always clear that someone who's got an immigration issue is going to have an asylum claim. So immigration, general immigration work, is not within scope for legal aid, and that creates a real problem when, you know, will people necessarily then go to a lawyer? You know, there's a problem with the availability of good legal aid reps across the country. You know, in some areas it's better than in others. A lot of legal aid firms who did immigration work would use their general immigration work to sort of cross-subsidise their asylum work, and obviously that's under threat as well. And recently there was a challenge around using eligibility for legal aid for those who were oppressing family reunion, but luckily that challenge has been successful. So it's not a good landscape. It's very worrying that the core. You know, we were very pleased that, you know, your asylum claim, you still are eligible for legal aid, but actually it's quite difficult to get access to solicitors at some point. Those who are funneled into a process called the detained fast tracks, once they've applied for it, they give some information to a screening officer and say what country they're from, what they're doing. Some people have their asylum claim processed within a detention centre in an accelerated process in a matter of weeks, and getting any kind of decent legal representation at that point. You know, bear in mind, no one has committed any crime. You have a right to apply for asylum. People think that people are asylum seekers detained once their claim has been refused and prior to removal. That's not the case. Some people are detained at the beginning. They have limited access to legal representation, limited time to get their evidence together. And, you know, our arguments are these are life and death decisions. Yes. If this goes wrong, the consequences of removing someone are massive. If it's, you know, they're, you know, life-threatening. So it's not a good landscape in terms of the cuts across the legal sector.
Sorry. No, the other thing I was just going to add to that was that we haven't really touched upon, you know, the whole scandal of immigration detention. And, you know, let's be clear, when we talk about immigration detention, we're talking about prisons.
Yes,
you know.
I must tell you about something about
euphemistic
that.
Language. Yes.
No, I was sitting at some grand event next to a chap who worked very closely with Boris Johnson, apparently our next Prime Minister, who left and got a big payoff and was working for one of these security companies. And I gave him an earful saying, okay, I want to come to this particular detention centre. You're telling me that we're very unfair to you. Here's your challenge. Within 24 hours, 48 hours, arrange a visit. And you can come with me if you like, and don't prettify it. Have I heard back from him? No. This was 3 months ago, and he promised me that he would take me into one of these detention centres. Story number 2, let us not forget the poor cleaner, the Colombian cleaner of the last immigration minister, who was paid £7 an hour for 6 years. Well, she was working for Mr. and Mrs. for 6 years, I think. £7 an hour. She's deported. She's not just deported. 7 guys turn up at her daughter's wedding. Okay? They don't let her, they can't wait 12 minutes for the wedding to be over. No, they crash their wedding, they pull her away without informing any lawyers so that they could ask for an injunction. They stick her on a flight. And guess what? He's got his job back. He's got his job back. And we just take this. We just take this as a society. The deep injustice of what's happened. As we're about to finish, I must tell you this very funny story too. My mother-in-law is very English and lives in Shoreham by Sea and reads the Daily Mail and blah, blah, blah. But it's lovely, has been lovely to me, and, you know, first person of colour and coming into her life. She's 93 now, but 2 years ago, she rang me absolutely palpitating with anxiety. Vera couldn't talk. I said, what's the matter, Vera? Why are you like this? She said, tell me about this, tell me about this. Tell me about this problem. What are we going to do about it? I said, what problem? She said, I keep hearing about the silent creepers that are everywhere and we can't stop them. And I thought, what silent creepers? She said, have you looked in your garden? Are they the silent? She had misheard. Asylum seekers. And this poor 91-year-old was going completely crazy that we were going to be killed by weeds. So, thank you. Thank you. I thought we must have a cheerful story. Thank you. Well done, all of you.